Okay, my name's Greg Rehmke, and I work with a group called Economic Thinking. I basically do workshops on the economics of each year's debate topics. Anybody been to one of my talks before, one of my seminars? I recognize some people. Okay. Each year there's a different topic, and so I try and find economics that applies to that topic. It's our experience and background that economics gives you an advantage in speech and debate. You can see connections that other people can't. It's going to benefit you, I would argue. My background happens to be in development economics, in economic history. I got a degree at the University of Washington that had a very strong economic history department. And I'm going to argue that the central problem in the Middle East is one of economic development, or the lack of economic development. And this is for a variety of reasons, and we're going to go through those today. And I'm going to argue that by understanding development economics, you're going to have an advantage in understanding debate. The key issue, too, is that most people that study the Middle East are people involved with international relations, people involved with security issues or military issues. And the argument is that this is a disadvantage for them. Studying political science in college instead of economics can be a disadvantage in this. And again, of course, it depends where you study and what you learn and so forth. But I'm going to argue that economics matters a lot. Okay. So when we look at what's wrong with the Middle East, right? We've got, first off, is a broad background. If you look at the media, it sounds like the world's falling apart. Everything's terrible. There's conflict, people dying, all this. It turns out we have the greatest degree of peace in the world in recorded history. We have the least violence, the fewest wars, the most incredible economic progress ever. Now, the TV news could have stories about that. They could show endless videos of people peacefully creating wealth and raising their families. But that doesn't make for good television. Television often shows disasters. So if you look at economic studies of this or just overall studies, you find that, the real problems happened a century ago, right, in World War I. World War I and the whole 20th century, World War I, World War II, massive destruction and battles, and so that's a huge issue. We're happily not in that situation now. We've got problems, but nothing like in the past. But where are the trouble spots? The trouble spots are in the Middle East, in Ukraine, Russia, places where people are poor, where there's lack of economic development. So what's the problem in the Middle East? Is it religious conflict, and maybe Islam is economically repressive for people in the Middle East, and radical Islam is causing additional conflicts? Or maybe it's the Western intervention. You hear this a lot, the imperialist, interventionist of Western Europe, England and France, that came into the Middle East after World War I, fall of the Ottoman Empire, put up these artificial borders where you've got these ethno-religious cuts where the borders don't match the people, so the governments don't work. That's part of it. Is it, centuries and centuries of life under the Ottoman Empire, right? This is a very repressive or a backward empire, at least in the later centuries. And so people, wherever the Ottoman Empire was, you find problems now. And then the massive turmoil of World War I and World War II. I was researching this topic and happened to watch the movie Patton with George C. Scott. It's a great movie, and it starts off where? In Morocco and Tunisia. Right, and you see the tribal people wandering around with their camels and the tanks coming in, blowing things up, incredible turmoil. And that was World War II, so not so long ago. Or are there some other reasons? So part of what we're doing is doing an investigation of what sort of problems give us a better understanding of the Middle East, and there's all these different theories of what contributes most to it. I'm going to reference a number of videos that give you a background on the topic. I saw online there's something called Open Culture that has a zillion videos online, and it has a mention of John Kenneth Galbraith's TV documentary called The Age of Affluence. John Kenneth Galbraith was a Keynesian, confidant of John Kennedy, the President Kennedy, ambassador to India, and all these different things. And he did this TV documentary on what's wrong or what sort of economic policy would be best. And it's sort of modern liberalism, Democratic Party stuff. We need more government, more regulation. But he got it on PBS, which is a big thing. And he had basically 50 minutes of him saying what he believed as an economist, and then there'd be like a 5-minute or a 10-minute rebuttal by a market-oriented economist. And one of the episodes was on the causes of poverty. And he had this, the whole 50 minutes on what the causes of poverty were. And then there was a short response at the end with P.T. Bower, Lord Bower, a British development economist. And he basically walks up to the camera, and his response was simply one sentence. He says, poverty has no causes. Wealth has causes. And then he turned around and walked away. That was all he had to say. But the point of that is that poverty is the norm. The way things are in the Middle East and Egypt and other countries, that's pretty normal. That's the way things were through most of recorded history. Right, so it's not unusual to have people, with donkeys and carts and living in thatched roof huts and so forth. So what requires explanation is why sort of this tremendous economic expansion in Western Europe beginning in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. So part of that, so to tell that story, and again, I can't spend a lot of time with that, but you've got Adam Smith, who was a moral philosopher, his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He's a Scottish professor. He then wrote The Wealth of Nations. And The Wealth of Nations is basically trying to respond to this question. He's looking around in the mid-1700s in Scotland and finding that Scotland, which used to be the poorest country in all of Europe, right, in the 1600s, by the 1750s is getting wealthier. People are living better, living longer, better houses, better clothes, better food. And he's asking, why is Scotland becoming wealthy? And in that, so this is a father of economics, and he's basically arguing that it's markets, international trade, and government sort of getting out of the way explains why Holland, England, and Scotland are becoming wealthy. That the mercantilist system that used to exist of governments trying to manage the economy was holding things back. Governments couldn't figure out how to do things right, and they were mostly interested in warfare. If you're interested in reading more on this, How the Scots Invented the Modern World is a nice sort of modern survey of the Scottish Enlightenment. Basically, he argues that the Scots were the main people behind the British Empire. They're the leaders in science, medicine, and a whole range of fields in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and how Scotland exploded from this poor backward country to a prosperous country is part of that story. But again, we're sort of asking, how did Scotland, this backward place, turn prosperous? So in one of the handouts, so let me switch gears because it's relevant to this topic from economic history and Adam Smith to international relations theory. IR theory, international relations theory, is a central area for U.S. Middle East policy. And the handout is simply an overview of classical liberal international relations theory. And so you've got a lot of people, when they talk about international relations, they talk about power balances and alliances and classical Greek authors writing about how nations work together. Classical liberal relations theory basically breaks with the older power alliance story and basically says that trade, commerce, investment, the same things that make market economics work apply to international relations theory. That is, what's the goal? The goal should be increasing prosperity, freedom, and peace, and that comes through trade. The more commerce there is, the more migration, the more investment, the more interconnected people are, the more peaceful society will be. So, for example, in the New York Times last week was an editorial by a Palestinian who argued that the last 10 years between Egypt and the Palestinian territories have been disastrous, in part because of the borders being closed. He argued that for years before that, every day tens of thousands of Palestinians would travel into Israel to work. They would work as accountants in engineering firms and construction jobs, taking care of families, and basically over a decade, Even though there were, of course, many conflicts still, there were Israeli people getting to know Palestinian people getting to know Israeli people, Palestinians making money by working for Israelis, and Israelis benefiting from Palestinians working for them. And this connections between the people led to people understanding, and benefits and progress. And then that got cut off, and that may have been the terrorists, the Islamists, trying to find a way to stop it. And so the bombings and so forth, basically the Israelis had to cut off Palestinians coming in because there were too many people running around with bombs and blowing up buses and things like that. But that lack of commerce makes things worse. So again, that's so another example of that. U.S. and China, power issues. We talk about China growing, the military growing. 15 or so years ago, a U.S. military plane was flying along the outskirts of China in international airspace. The Chinese sent their military and forced the plane down. One Chinese pilot was killed, and our spy plane basically was forced down in China. This was a huge international incident, right? I was at the Heritage Foundation at a conference when that happened, and I remember the speaker being furious at the Chinese and saying that the United States needed to get tough with China, and the U.S. corporations would have to find someone else to exploit. This is a Free Market Heritage Foundation, right? And the push was, we need to get tough with China and show them stuff. And the Chinese were furious too, because our plane, they claimed, was spying on them, which is true. We claimed that our plane was in international space, which was true. But that led to an incident. But here's the trade story. When this blew up and everyone was upset about it, U.S. businesses went to the government and basically said, be very, very careful. We have billions and billions of dollars invested in China. We get all these products from China. They're a huge market for us and the source. If you do anything that interrupts trade relations, that's going to be really bad for the U.S. economy. In China, Chinese businessmen went to the Chinese government and said, be really, really careful. If you do anything to piss off the United States and they block our exports, or if they stop investing, we'll have tens of millions of people out of work. We'll have riots. So the argument here is the militaristic, nationalistic side of all of us that wanted to get upset about China. The counterbalance to that was the business relationships where people saying this is really bad for the U.S. economy, really bad for U.S. corporations. Now you can view that as sort of a cowardly response by the U.S. government, caving into business pressure, and the Chinese nationalists could view the same thing. But the classical liberal relations theory people say that's good. Anything that promotes peace and that de-escalates hostilities is a good thing.